About half of our calories come from carbohydrates. So if I say to you, stop eating carbohydrates, what have I done? I've cut your calorie content in half. And what happens? You lose weight. Sure. We sued the US government because the guidelines were being produced by scientists who had financial relationships with the dairy and meat industries in particular. You don't need a lot, maybe an ounce a day of nuts or seeds. People who get the most vitamin E cut their risk of Alzheimer's by about 50%. When what we discover is the fat starts to dissipate and diabetes improves. And we start to see diabetes improving to the point where people need less medicine, maybe no medicine at all. And when a person does these simple things, the arteries start opening up again. He showed that coronary artery disease is reversible. So we'll see, for example, that while the contribution of dairy is more to breast cancer and to prostate cancer, the contribution of meat is more to colorectal cancer.
That was a glimpse of my interview with Dr. Neal Barnard, the founder and president of Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine and the best-selling author. As a plant-based diet continues to gain popularity, mainly due to the research that consistently shows its benefits, I invited Dr. Barnard, one of the pioneers in the field, to educate me on the subject and answer the questions that skeptics tend to ask. I was also curious to hear how this diet helps to prevent and even reverse certain illnesses such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe. And now we start. I looked through Wikipedia and it has your date of birth. And I have to admit, you look much younger than your date of birth suggests. So here's my question. How much of it do you think is due to genetics, and how much of it do you think is due to lifestyle and particular diet we're going to be discussing today?
You know, the genetics side of things, that's the part that we really can't change. And let's face it, the human body is a fragile thing. You can take really good care of yourself and things can still go wrong. Just like an automobile, you really care for it, but things are going to still break down. And that's true of the human body too. That said, our bodies really are affected by the foods that we eat. And the more that we kick out the animal products, the meat, the dairy, the eggs, and the junk, the better off we're going to be. So we want to do everything that we can to protect ourselves, and more importantly, to use that same knowledge to protect our families.
Let's draw the distinction between a vegan diet and whole food plant-based diet, because it's those two being confused quite a bit. Can you tell us a little bit about both of them?
Well, the word vegan has been around for a long period of time, and a vegan diet is a great thing. A vegan diet means you don't eat animal products. That is a good move, because when you get the meat out of the diet and the dairy and the eggs out of the diet, you've eliminated all the cholesterol. You've eliminated the big sources of saturated fat. That's the bad fat that's linked to Alzheimer's disease and heart disease. So that's a good thing. Now, some people will say, well, in addition to that, I think what I'd like to do is to eat foods in as natural a form as possible. So rather than grinding grains into spaghetti, maybe I would have whole grains that are not processed. And some people refer to that as a whole foods diet or a whole foods plant-based diet. And that's a sensible thing too, to eat foods in as natural a form as possible rather than having them overly processed. However, some people will criticize the vegan diet mistakenly, in my view, saying, well, there could be junk food in the diet, so we all want to be whole foods plant-based. I think that's wrong, because when a person gets rid of animal products and follows the vegan diet, that is always a really good idea. For many people, though, that's not the end of the exploration. That's the beginning. All right, I got rid of the animal products. Now what do I do? Should I also reduce oils? The answer is yes. Should I also get rid of sugary junk stuff? The answer is yes. But just by going vegan, you've done a great, that's a terrific place to start.
If you would name the worst offenders in the Western diet, you already mentioned meat, dairy, sugar, processed food, probably. Which one would you put on the top?
Well, meat and dairy are probably the worst of these, but they affect us differently. Meat products are a big glob. Meat is an animal muscle, and so animal muscles don't have complex carbohydrates. They don't have vitamin C. It's a glob of protein and fat. And so that will contribute to cardiovascular disease. I'm talking about heart disease, and contribute to certain cancers. Now, dairy products are also bad, but in a different way, because they also have estradiol in them. That's a female sex hormone. So there's some of that in meat, but not so much. Dairy products are a more major source of that. They also have lactose sugar in them, so they affect the body differently. So we'll see, for example, that while the contribution of dairy is more to breast cancer and to prostate cancer, the contribution of meat is more to colorectal cancer. So meat is a problem, dairy is a problem. And from the standpoint of animal welfare, they're both really bad. It used to be that some people would think, okay, I won't eat meat because who wants to support an industry that hangs up a chicken by the legs and hacks his head off? I mean, it's obviously not a very compassionate choice. And they would give a green light to dairy products. Well, then when people look at dairy in a little bit more detail, they realize the animal welfare aspects of dairy are that you artificially inseminate a cow. Then when her calves are born, you take the calves away. If they're males, you kill them for veal. If they're females, you raise them in isolation until they can be artificially inseminated. And while cows live to be about 20 in nature, on dairy farms, they're all dead at age 4 and they're killed for meat. So I guess either of those is, to any sensible, compassionate person, not the kind of thing that you want to support.
You mentioned the hormones on dairy that affect people, and you actually wrote the book about it recently. Can you kind of, not to summarize, but give it like a little more color behind how the hormones in the food affect our body?
Researchers in California looked at a large group of people who followed different kinds of diets, and they tracked their health over time. Now, they were very careful in the group that they selected. They selected a religious group called Seventh-day Adventists. And the reason that they have studied them, and frankly, the reason a lot of researchers have studied them, is they are almost all non-smokers. They're very health-conscious people and tend not to drink alcohol. And so they're a researcher's dream. And in this particular study, they looked at, 60 or 70,000 of them. And they tracked how much dairy products they ate. How many glasses of milk in the course of a day or a week would you consume? Cheese, sour cream, ice cream. And what they found was striking. The more the individuals consumed milk, the higher their risk of developing breast cancer. Now, how could a glass of milk influence your risk of breast cancer? Well, of course, the milk came out of a cow. The cow was impregnated. And a pregnant cow makes estradiol. That's a female sex hormone. Now, they make it when they're not pregnant, but they make a lot more when they are pregnant, and it gets into the milk. And if you give that glass of milk to your 7-year-old daughter, she's drinking estradiol. Now, estradiol has many other effects, but the effect on cancer is the one that we're really zeroing in on. Now, the reason that we're taking this seriously, there have been studies that didn't show that showed that milk didn't seem to have a statistical relationship with breast cancer. And the problem is that those studies were typically done in U.S. populations, all of whom are getting dairy. They're they're drinking it directly, or it's in cheese, or it's in snack foods, and it was hard to have a good comparison. But another study that just recently came out in China. China historically is not a dairy country. It's not ice cream and Velveeta. But since more and more westernization has occurred, there's more milk consumption. And researchers have tracked milk in China and found that compared to women who really avoid dairy, those who consume dairy have substantially higher risks of breast cancer. We're seeing similar links with prostate cancer in men. The more dairy, more prostate cancer. In fact, the evidence is really quite strong. So we do think that these hormones are one of the big drivers of it. There are other drivers too. Milk also contains something called IGF-1, or insulin-like growth factor, number 1. And when you drink it, your body even makes more and more IGF-1. And IGF-1 causes cancer cells to grow. So those are some of the concerns that we have. And the big problem is that many people have no idea. They think, I should give my child milk because it has calcium. And the answer is, please don't do that. There are healthier sources of calcium that don't have these problems associated with them.
So what are the sources? Is it like multivitamins or actual plants? Actual plants.
The cows don't make calcium. The only reason there's calcium in milk is that the cow ate plants. Now, the cow's eating grass. Hopefully you're having, not grass, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kale, collard greens. They all have calcium, and the calcium from green leafy vegetables is about twice that of, proportionately is about the absorption fraction is about double the amount in milk. Now, milk is very concentrated in calcium, but only about a third of it is absorbed. For something like Brussels sprouts, it has a little bit less calcium, but about twice the percentage is absorbed from the green vegetables.
Some would argue that humans have been eating animal products since the beginning? Like, why didn't we adapt? Why is it suddenly became bad for us?
Well, human beings are not naturally carnivores. You're not a cat. You're not a leopard. You're not a lion. We are, whether we like it or not, we are great apes. And if you look at what the other great apes eat, I'm talking about chimpanzees and bonobos and orangutans and gorillas, they are either entirely or mainly vegan. None of them is eating a bowl of ice cream. None is ever having a grilled cheese sandwich, and they are never having a burger. They're not ever having a chicken salad sandwich. They don't do these things. And Jane Goodall, who many years ago set foot in Tanzania to track chimpanzee diet and behavior and culture, found that the number one food they like is fruit, enormous amounts of fruit, followed by leaves and shoots and berries and other things. So these are the principal foods for a primate. So a cat, on the other hand, is not eating apples and pears and mangoes. Cats are obligate carnivores, and humans who try to eat like that, unfortunately, have a higher risk of all kinds of problems.
There was this big rise on different types of diets, and carnivore was one of them, keto, and it seemed like it did work for certain people, at least when it came to weight loss. Why is that?
You can certainly lose weight on many different kinds of diets. You can lose weight by taking up smoking. Seriously. You can lose weight by just trying not to eat. There are many ways to do it. A low carbohydrate diet has been a fad off and on for a long period of time. And the idea is carbohydrates. That means starchy foods and sugary foods. That's about half of what we eat. If you look at people eat bread, or they eat rice, or they eat potatoes and sweet potatoes and beans, and about half of our calories come from carbohydrates. So if I say to you, stop eating carbohydrates, what have I done? I've cut your calorie content in half. And what happens? You lose weight. Sure. After a little while, you get sick of never having bread, never having a cookie, never having cake, never eating a carrot, never having a potato. It becomes annoying. And so people go back to eating those foods, and they start gaining weight because their calorie content goes back up to normal. In the meanwhile, because they were busily eating meat and things that they thought were okay because they didn't have carbs, their cholesterol level went up. And the cardiovascular risks of a low carbohydrate diet are significant. And I would encourage people not to ever go on a low carbohydrate diet. You don't need it. Moreover, carbohydrates aren't the devil. Carbohydrates, again, this is starch, like in a potato or rice or bread or sugar. If you send it to a laboratory, they will say it's got 4 calories in every gram of carbohydrate, 4 calories. Send them some chicken fat or dairy fat. They'll say, wow, it's got 9 calories in every gram. So if you really want to lose weight and do it easily without going hungry, eat more carbohydrates. Eat lots of grains and starchy vegetables and beans, and you fill up on those foods without a lot of calories. And by avoiding animal products and fatty foods in general, you can lose weight very, very easily. So in the research studies that we do, we bring people in. We don't tell them to limit calories at all. They don't have to limit carbohydrate. They lose weight very, very easily with a completely low-fat vegan diet. And kind of back to where you started, do they lose weight if it's vegan, or does it have to be whole foods and so forth? Just by throwing out animal products and keeping oils low, people will lose weight. And of course, we hope that they'll eat the healthiest ones, healthiest choices.
And one of the argument you would hear often is B12. Like, how do people get B12 if they don't eat meat? And do we necessarily need to take supplements, or can you find it in different types of food?
You do need a source of B12, and it either has to be fortified foods, of which there are many. But to tell you the truth, you might be missing that. I don't want you to have to look at your breakfast cereal to see if it's got B12 in it, or to pick up a jar of nutritional yeast, which you may not be using every day. These foods do have B12 added, but the safest thing is to take a supplement. So if you take any multiple vitamin, a 1-a-day style vitamin, you'll get B12. Or you can go to the health food store and just get a B12 supplement there. That's always the simplest thing to do.
When you speak with people who kind of, I'm sure you have debates, etc., do you ever hear the questions such as, well, if B12 is essential, why do we have to take supplements in order to get it? Why don't we get it in in sufficient quantities in nature?
Because you don't live in nature. You don't live anywhere in nature. You don't live. You might live in New Jersey. You're not living in nature. B12 is not made by animals. It's not made by plants. It's made by bacteria. And so some people have suggested that the bacteria, way back when, in our mouths, on our fingers, in the soil, in the plants that we would consume, those traces of bacteria would give us the amount that we need, which is 2.4 micrograms is the amount you need. And you do need it. You need it for healthy nerves and healthy blood. And the advent of modern hygiene has eliminated that bacterial source, and in some ways, thankfully so, because we don't want to be bathing in bacterial contamination, particularly nowadays. And so you take a supplement instead. Now, whether that's really true or not, it's hard to know, but you do need to take a source of B12. Now, you could also put the shoe on the other foot. If some people wanted to say, well, you should be eating meat because you obviously need B12, and this is an argument against it. Meat has 0 vitamin C. So if you're a big meat eater, you're going to end up with scurvy. And vitamin C is something that plants provide. So anyway, there you have it. But people can argue these things if they want to. But the bottom line is when you look at who's the healthiest, who's the slimmest within a good range, who's got the lowest cholesterol levels, the greatest longevity, it's really people whose diets are based on 4 things. And that's vegetables and fruits and whole grains and beans and all the wonderful things that come from them. And when your body is busily rejoicing the good foods that you're fueling it with, the animals are happy too. And the earth is breathing easier because, let's face it, a meat-based diet, a dairy-based diet is one of the greatest ways of destroying a planet, because the belching cows are belching methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, much worse than CO2. The feed grains that it requires to feed chickens or pigs or cows, they consume so much fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation water, that it's just a totally unsustainable system. And what I'm saying is nothing new. People have known this for 50 years. It's just that people know things and they don't address them. People have been all too willing to let animals go to slaughter, let the planet go to hell, and not worry about their coronary arteries or their children's health. And it's really time that we are honest with ourselves and sensible and hopefully slightly compassionate with those with whom we share this planet, including our own families.
When you look at your research, what does it show in terms of this diet being able to prevent certain diseases and reverse them?
Well, first of all, let me say, thank you for asking about our research. I'm delighted to describe it. And we've had many, I think, really important breakthroughs. However, I do want to acknowledge that there are actually many researchers who have contributed really breakthrough research for many years. And let me cite the work of Dr. Dean Ornish, who back more than 30 years ago showed that heart disease, I'm talking about those artery blockages in your arteries, that when you get the animal products out of the diet and you follow a healthy lifestyle, you're not smoking, you're physically active, you're not overly stressed. When a person does these simple things, the arteries start opening up again. He showed that coronary artery disease is reversible. Nobody thought that was possible because it wasn't possible by eating chicken and fish and that kind of stuff. But it is possible with a healthy diet. Our team has looked, first of all, at weight loss, where we found that you don't have to limit calories. You don't have to limit carbohydrates at all. You don't even have to exercise. Exercise is great. But even if a person does not do it, by avoiding animal products, keeping oils low, weight loss just occurs on its own. And it continues for as long as the diet continues, which is a wonderful thing. And then we turned our sights to diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is something that I have to say, in a way, I feel I kind of grew up with it because my father was a diabetes doctor in Fargo, North Dakota. And he would get home every day, 6 o'clock, and set down his bag, having worked at the clinic all day. And he never, ever said that a case of diabetes had ever been cured, because they didn't use diets that really were very different. They didn't know about what diet could do. And our team was able to take advantage of a real breakthrough, which is we found out what causes diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is caused by the buildup of fat particles in your muscle cells, also in your liver cells. And when fat particles build up in the cells, that cell can no longer take in sugar from your blood effectively, because it can't respond to the insulin that is trying to get that muscle cell to take in sugar. It doesn't happen. The cell is full of fat. So all we did, the most logical thing, we brought in people who had type 2 diabetes and said, let's get the fat out of your diet. No animal products. That means on a vegan diet, there's no animal fat at all. If we also keep oils low, even the good fats, what we discover is the fat starts to dissipate and diabetes improves. And we start to see diabetes improving to the point where people need less medicine, maybe no medicine at all, and maybe the diabetes itself actually goes away. So from there, we've looked at many other conditions, but our goal is to always see what we can do with a really healthy diet to improve these conditions as much as we can.
And I believe you also did some research on Alzheimer, that the diet helps there as well.
I think we need a lot more research on Alzheimer's disease. Let me give some credit to Martha Claire Morris and her team in Chicago. The Chicago Health and Aging Project brought in a large group of people in Chicago. And what they did is they tracked what they ate, and then they tracked who stayed mentally clear as the years went by and who did not. Mm-hmm. And what they found was really striking, that saturated fat, that's the fat that predominates in dairy products and predominates in meat. Those who ate the most saturated fat had about 3 times the risk of developing Alzheimer's compared to people who generally avoided it. Now, put this the other way. Let's say you've got Alzheimer's in your family. You think, I don't want to get it. It looks to us, based on the evidence that we have, if you avoid animal products altogether, and other sources of saturated fat too, like coconut oil, palm kernel oil, those are among the very few plant sources of saturated fat. If you avoid those things, it looks like the risk of Alzheimer's would drop by probably 60 or 70%. If you include in your diet a good source of vitamin E, that's nuts and seeds. You don't need a lot, maybe an ounce a day of nuts or seeds. People who get the most vitamin E cut their risk of Alzheimer's by about 50%. People who lace up their sneakers and exercise, they reduce the risk too. So if we put all these together, it looks like you could dramatically reduce the risk. That said, I think we need more studies to prove that. Dean Ornish, again, is doing a study now on people who have early stage dementia, and his results will be coming out soon. We're very eager to see what he's found. But some halfway measures are not so good. There's a diet called the MIND diet, which Martha Claire Morris and her team designed based on their earlier research. But they did not remove animal fat. They reduced it a little bit. It was sort of a Mediterranean diet. Have chicken, have fish instead of red meat. And what they showed is it doesn't really work. So what the study that needs to be done, and has not yet been done, is have a large group of people at risk for Alzheimer's disease, get them on the healthiest diet you can, no animal products at all, supplement their B12, of course, get them exercising, and see if you can reduce the risk. My best guess is that it would work really well, but it has to be proven.
What would you say are the most common myths about this diet?
About a vegan diet?
Yes.
Plant-based diet? There are all kinds of myths, but let me be clear where these myths are coming from. Everybody is suspicious of any sort of new idea that comes in, and not just about diet, but about anything. Mm-hmm. And I think people are right to be suspicious because there's a lot of nonsense in the world. And especially if someone has an idea like you should eat differently, we consider that a bit of a threat. So people try to find ways to push new ideas away. So sometimes when people have raised a myth about the diet, they're not necessarily trying to think logically. They're just trying to push away the news that changing the way they eat might be good for them. But the common myths, one is that eating vegan is expensive. We actually have studied that, and we brought in 244 people, asked half of them to keep their regular diet and the other half to follow a diet with no animal products and minimizing oils. And what we found is that their food expenses dropped by about 16% on this diet, which works out to about $500 a year. So it's not more expensive, it's less expensive. What is expensive is buying cheese and buying pork chops and steak and all that stuff. That's costly. Plus the heart attacks are kind of costly too. The second myth is that you can't get protein from plants. The fact of the matter is you get plenty of protein from any diet that is a varied diet of plant foods. You'll get all the essential amino acids that you need. But let me, may I give you a little bit of background on this, because I know people get a little confused.
Please.
Okay. All right. Protein. If you look at a protein molecule under a microscope, it's like a string of beads, and each bead is an amino acid. And to make up the proteins in your muscles or in any of your organs or in your skin, each protein is a little bit different. There are proteins that are turned into enzymes in your body, and they use different amino acids. There are certain amino acids that are essential, meaning those are building blocks your body can't create. So many people had the mistaken notion that plants didn't have all the essential amino acids. They only had some. And if you wanted to get all the amino acids, you had to eat a pork chop or a piece of bacon or something like that. That is a complete myth. All plants have all the essential amino acids. And so if you eat plants, you will get them. Now, different plants are different. And that's why it's good to have a variety. So if you're going to have beans, have some rice with it. But people do that naturally. Our tastes are naturally programmed to want variety. And that's your body's way of making sure it gets the nutrition it needs. So a person who is eating any varied diet of plant foods will get all the protein that they need. And that's true even if you're an Olympic athlete, even if you're a weightlifter, a bodybuilder, whatever, you don't need animal products for protein at all. So those are a couple of the big myths. I'll give you one last one. One is about soy. Mm-hmm. Soy milk, tofu. These are really healthy foods, and they have been consumed throughout Asia for centuries. And Asia has had a remarkably low risk of certain cancers, very little breast cancer in Asia. But starting when the diet in Japan and China began to westernize, a little bit in the 60s and 70s, but especially in the 80s and 90s, dairy came in, meat came in, and we started to see more breast cancer in those countries, as I mentioned earlier. And some people started to get the idea that soy was causing the breast cancer. And to this day, you'll hear people mistakenly say that soy causes breast cancer. Mm-hmm. What they're getting at is that soy products, soybeans, have what are called isoflavones in them. And isoflavones have the technical names genistein, daidzein, glycine, and so forth. And they do actually attach to estrogen receptors. So some people mistakenly thought, wow, that must be causing cancer. But then when you actually look in research studies at women who consume the most soybeans, most tofu, the most soy milk, the most miso or tempeh, they have the least risk of getting breast cancer. And when women who have been diagnosed with breast cancer eat more soybeans, they live longer. They're less likely to have the cancer kill them. So soybeans are actually protective. So researchers have gone a step further, and they found that there are two different kinds of estrogen receptors: the alpha receptors and the beta receptors. The alpha receptor is the site where estradiol from milk attaches. That alpha receptor will drive breast cancer. The beta receptor is the one where the isoflavones preferentially attach. And you can think of that as the brake on cancer. So soy is not bad for you. It's just the opposite. The women who consume the most soy products have about 30% less risk of breast cancer, and men who consume soy have a reduction in their risk of prostate cancer.
You started PCRM about almost 40 years ago. For people who don't know, what's PCRM and what's the mission of the organization?
Sure. I was just out of my medical training. I was working in New York, and I set up a group with the name the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And my idea was that to do medicine responsibly, we don't just wait for a heart attack to occur and come into the emergency room and then we try to make the patient survive. We don't just wait for breast cancer to show up on a mammogram. We do what we can to prevent these things. And that means helping our patients to adopt healthier lifestyles, especially healthier dietary habits. It means more than that, though. It means that when we do research, we should do research that really gets us where we need to go. There are a lot of researchers still, I'm sorry to say, doing experiments that are not only not very helpful, but are unethical. I'm talking about experiments on, say, monkeys. There are some recent experiments done in North Carolina at a university called Wake Forest, where they were trying to study the benefits of a Mediterranean diet. But what they did is, instead of bringing in people and putting them on a healthy diet, they caged monkeys and gave them biscuits that they called Mediterranean diet biscuits, and didn't really find out much of anything worthwhile. So these are illustrations of the kinds of things that we address. We want ethical research, good preventive medicine, a real focus on what matters for patients, and that means a focus on good nutrition. So we do research studies, we have educational programs, and people can learn about it at our website, which is pcrm.org.
And my understanding is occasionally you have communication with USDA and other government organizations about dietary guidelines. What's dietary guidelines, and how is it being influenced by USDA, and how receptive they are to you and your studies?
Terrific question. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans are a set of guidelines for what people are supposed to eat. They're extremely influential because every food assistance program has to follow them. So every child in every school in the United States who is selecting foods from their cafeteria, in every single case, those foods are dictated by the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. It's good to have standards, but the problem is that those dietary guidelines say have meat, have dairy products. In fact, have dairy products 3 times a day. Now, we've been talking about dairy products and breast cancer, meat and colorectal cancer. Do the dietary guidelines increase the risk of those diseases? The answer is yes. The guidelines, though, by law have to be revised every 5 years. So we have been involved in that process. And in the year 2000, we sued the US government because the guidelines were being produced by scientists who had financial relationships with the dairy and meat industries in particular. And that's doesn't conform with federal law. And we won that lawsuit. And as a result of that, the dietary guidelines process has been opened up quite a lot. And so we weigh in very heavily when the guidelines are being reconsidered. We point out the latest scientific evidence of what a healthy diet should consist of. And it's along the lines of what we've talked about. We've made a lot of progress over time. The guidelines are better than they've been. They put a great emphasis on foods from plants, and they do acknowledge strongly that a healthy vegetarian diet is a good thing. But they still have too much emphasis on dairy and meat. And so we're working with them to clean that up. I think we will win with this, but it took a long time to pry the government away from promoting tobacco products, and it's going to take them a bit longer to get away from livestock products as well.
How involved is food industry in the lobbying USDA and other agencies? And is it getting better or worse? And how do you characterize it?
The food industry is as omnipresent in the food debate and in federal food policies as the tobacco industry was before it. And I'm sorry to say that their influence is felt very strongly. In September, I believe it was September 12th, if I'm remembering correctly, there was a public forum that the government held to ask people to weigh in on the current dietary guidelines for Americans. And I'm sorry to say that although there were many scientists and physicians, including me, who weighed in on that and gave hopefully good advice on what the guidelines should support. The meat industry was there, the dairy industry was there, the egg industry was there, the candy industry, the liquor industry, all these people weighed in as well. And they push very hard because they know that if their products are part of the guidelines, they're going to make money. That's their motivation. That said, we've been more and more able to push them to the side. And I'm confident that as time goes on, the guidelines will be more and more vegan friendly.
Just to clarify, because supposedly what they propose should be based on science, but how are they able to tweak the science? Is it like cherry picking the facts, or what? How is it possible for them to continue push the meat and dairy into the diet?
The dietary guidelines for Americans are a joint project of the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services. And they select a committee, and the committee is supposed to be a balanced committee of roughly a dozen people, give or take. And some of these people have had economic relationships with the dairy industry, for example. That's what we litigated about years ago. And but there are still some of them today. Don't get me wrong, there are very good people on that committee as well, but there are some people who have industry ties that would make you raise your eyebrows. They come up with some kind of compromise report, and then that report, although it's supposed to be scientific, is then sent to the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And they, in turn, can modify what the committee has found and set up their own guidelines. So the committee is just advisory. And so if they don't say you should have a lot of dairy, the Secretary of Agriculture can overrule them and say, I want people to have dairy because it's an American industry. That's where we are. And people often say, if you saw how government policy and sausage are made, you really wouldn't want to look at it.
You wrote about 20 books, and I saw there are about 100 publications, maybe probably more. You run PCRM. When do you find time to play music?
Oh, thanks for asking about that. Yeah, I have a band. It's called CarbonWorks. And I hope people have a chance to look at it, because I imagine that my articles in a scientific journal might give some people some ideas, but there are sometimes when it's good to turn off the intellect and have something touch your heart a little bit. And CarbonWorks is a band of, I have to say, really wonderful musicians from all around the world. And our second album just came out. It's called Vanishing Act. And if you look on Amazon, you'll see it there. If you look on YouTube and you just go to the CarbonWorks channel, you'll see a lot of our music videos. You'll see both our albums represented. And we have a website called carbonworksmusic.com. So I hope people enjoy it. The musicians, as I mentioned, come from Italy, France, Vietnam, many from the United States, and I hope people enjoy it.
And it's kind of combination of jazz, rock, and a little bit blues. What was your musical influence?
Well, when I was a little kid, long before I thought I should become a doctor, I was studying the piano and the cello, and we had, take your little fingers and you try to play your instrument as well as you can, and then you join these school orchestras and those sorts of things. But I have to confess that when the Beatles came in, I was 10 years old, and the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show, and everybody was tuned in, and at that point, I looked at my cello and I thought, where's my electric guitar? And so I continued to play all those instruments. But since that time, I got influenced with jazz and rock and roll, and I fell in love with Vietnamese music and French music. And you'll hear all of these influences there as well.
For listeners of this interview, which book would you recommend to start their introduction to Neal Barnard's work out of those 20?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for asking about that. I guess the reason that I write for different books is that we find different things. So if a person has diabetes, for example, I would encourage them to look at the Diet for Reversing Diabetes. That's the title of the book, and that will help them. If a person is eager to lose weight, I have a book called the 21-Day Weight Loss Kickstart, and that will guide them step by step for how to use this for weight loss. Incidentally, I have a new book coming out in a couple of months called Power Foods, the Power Foods Diet, and it's because of some new discoveries that we're making, that certain foods are better for weight loss than other foods. Some of this is pretty obvious. A potato is better than potato chips, which have all that oil in them. But you could be much more nuanced than that and compare, say, berries and asparagus and soybeans and find the foods that are most powerful for weight loss. So that's a new book that's coming out in a few months.
Well, Dr. Barnard, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for the interview.
Well, let me thank you. I really appreciate your getting the word out. We can do research studies all day long, but you have people that you speak to, and you share information, and you'll never know whose life you influence. But I'm sure it's many, many people, and they in turn hear about what you've told them. They share it with their family members. They open the refrigerator door and make some choices that might be a little bit different based on the inspiration you've given them. So let me thank you as well.